Apologize now." The word didn't sound loud, but it cut clean through the room like something sharper than anger. I remember the way the glass in his hand stopped halfway to his lips, the way his eyes locked on me, not curious, not confused, but certain. Like he'd just seen a ghost he recognized. And then Mark laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not even a polite one, just a short, dismissive chuckle. "Come on, Uncle Frank," he said, "it's just a nickname." That's when I knew the evening was already over. Not the dinner, not the conversation. Something else. Something quieter and harder to put back together. A few hours earlier, I almost didn't go. I sat in my car outside the house in Fairfax, Virginia, engine idling longer than it should have. It was one of those neighborhoods built in the late 80s, two-story colonials, trimmed hedges, American flags on front porches. The kind of place where people knew each other's routines and waved from driveways. Normal. That word had always felt like something I borrowed, not something I owned. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. Hair pulled back, light makeup I'd had to relearn how to use, a navy blouse that didn't quite feel like me. No uniform, no rank, no gear, just a woman going to a family dinner. I turned off the engine. Just dinner, I told myself. I'd handled worse. Inside the house smelled like roast chicken, garlic, and something sweet baking in the oven. Warm lighting, voices overlapping, silverware clinking, someone laughing too loudly in the kitchen. My sister-in-law Jenna spotted me first. "Evie, you made it." She crossed the room and hugged me before I had time to prepare for it. I stood there a second longer than most people would, then returned it. "Wouldn't miss it," I said. That part wasn't entirely true. But Jenna didn't need to know that. She pulled me into the living room, introducing me to people whose names I immediately forgot. Cousins, in-laws, neighbors who might as well be family. Faces blurred together, smiles, polite nods, quick glances that lingered just a second too long. People always looked twice. Not because they knew who I was. Because they didn't. And something about that made them curious. Mark was leaning against the doorway between the living room and dining area when I first saw him. My brother-in-law. Jenna's husband. He had that easy confidence some men wear, like a second skin arms, crossed half smile already in mid-conversation with someone about golf or investments, or something equally distant from my world. When Jenna introduced us, he gave me a once-over. Not rude, not exactly. Just measuring. "So you're Evie," he said. "Heard you're Navy." I nodded. Was. "Retired already?" he asked, eyebrows lifting. "You don't look that old." "I'm not." He chuckled like we were already sharing a joke. Must have been a desk job then. I didn't respond. Silence has a way of making people fill it. But Mark just shrugged and turned back to his conversation like he'd already figured me out. That was fine. Most people think they have. We sat down for dinner around 6. Long wooden table, white plates, cloth napkins folded just right. Someone had gone through the trouble of making it feel like an occasion. I took a seat near the middle, not at the head, not tucked away at the end. Neutral ground. Across from me sat an older man I hadn't met yet, late 70s, maybe early 80s, straight posture, clear eyes, hands steady even as he lifted his glass. He didn't say much at first. Just watched. Not in a suspicious way. In a familiar one. Conversation started easy. Weather, traffic, the wedding coming up that weekend. Stories about how Jenna and Mark met, retold for the benefit of the older relatives who liked hearing them again. I listened more than I spoke. That's what I've always done. Out there, listening kept you alive. In here, it just made people think you were shy. Halfway through the meal, the conversation shifted the way it always does. From general to personal. "So Evie," someone down the table said, "what exactly did you do in the Navy?" A simple question. I took a sip of water before answering. Special operations. That usually ended it. Not because people understood, but because they didn't. And most folks over a certain age know when not to push. But Mark leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Special operations, huh?" There it was again. That tone. Curious but edged. "What does that mean exactly?" he asked. "Various assignments," I said. He smiled. "Sounds classified." I gave a small shrug. Some of it is. A few people chuckled politely. Mark didn't. He tilted his head, studying me like a puzzle he wanted to solve. Then he said it. So, you're in the Navy? I nodded once. He smirked. What's your nickname? The room didn't go silent right away. Not yet. There's always a moment, that small space where something could still go either way. I could have deflected. Made a joke. Changed the subject. But I didn't. I looked at him steady. And I answered. Mad Dog. A couple of people laughed. Light, uncertain. Like they thought I was playing along. Then I saw the man across from me. The older one. His glass stopped halfway to his mouth. His eyes didn't leave mine. And just like that, everything changed. Apologize now. His voice was low, but it carried. Every conversation at the table stopped. Mark blinked. Excuse me. The old man didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. You heard me, he said. Apologize. Mark let out a short laugh, glancing around like he expected backup. Uncle Frank, come on. I didn't say anything. Yes, you did. The words landed heavier this time. Mark's smile started to fade. And for the first time that evening, someone else in the room understood exactly what had just happened. I set my fork down gently. I'm fine, I said. But Uncle Frank didn't look at me. He kept his eyes on Mark. No, he said quietly, you're not. And neither was the room anymore. Nobody reached for a fork after that. The roast chicken cooled on the serving platter. The green beans sat untouched in their dish with the toasted almonds still glistening under the dining room light. Somewhere in the kitchen, a timer went off and kept beeping until Jenna hurried away to silence it. Even that ordinary little sound felt strange in the middle of the quiet. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I've lived through gunfire, rotor wash, and radio chatter so loud it rattled my bones, but I've learned that some of the heaviest moments in life happen in a room where nobody says a thing. Mark looked from Uncle Frank to me and back again. What is this? He asked, trying to laugh it off, though the laughter had already thinned out. Seriously, did I miss something? Uncle Frank finally set his glass down. Carefully, deliberately. His face had gone still in a way I recognized right away. Men of his generation wore certain expressions only when memory had taken hold of them. You asked her that question like it was a joke, he said. Mark spread his hands. It was a question. It was a challenge, Frank replied. I could feel every eye at the table shifting between us. Jenna came back in from the kitchen, took one look around and stopped short. What happened? No one answered her for a second. Then Mark said, apparently I committed some kind of crime by asking your sister what her nickname is. Sister-in-law Jenna corrected automatically, then looked at me. Evie. I'm all right, I said. That was the truth, at least on the surface. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't angry. I was tired, maybe. Tired in that old familiar way that had nothing to do with sleep. The thing about a nickname is that most people think it's a story they're entitled to hear. Something colorful, something entertaining. A little badge you wear so others can feel closer to danger without ever having to stand near it. But some names are really just receipts. Proof of what something cost. Frank drew in a breath and looked directly at me for the first time since he'd spoken. Did I hear you right? He asked. I nodded once. You did. He held my gaze for a beat longer than most people could. Then he leaned back in his chair and I saw it register in him all over again, not excitement, not admiration. Recognition. The kind that doesn't make a person feel bigger. The kind that makes the room smaller. My mother used to say older Americans carry history differently. Not louder, just deeper. They know what it means when a name goes still in a room. Frank was that kind of man. Mark, on the other hand, had never had to learn stillness the hard way. He sat back with a little shrug and said, Okay, somebody help me out here because now I'm curious. That's part of your problem, Frank said. The words were plain, but they landed hard enough to make Jenna wince. Uncle Frank, she said gently, maybe let's all calm down. I am calm. And he was. That was the unsettling part. He wasn't angry in a hot-blooded way. He was angry the way some old men get when they've seen enough in life to know the exact weight of disrespect. Across the table, Aunt Louise cleared her throat softly. Frank, do you know Evie from somewhere? He shook his head. No, not personally. Then he looked at me again. But I know the name. I felt my shoulders tighten even though I kept my face neutral. I'd spent years training my body not to announce discomfort. It's a habit that stays long after the need is gone. Mark caught that sentence and tried to make light of it. "Oh, come on," he said. "What is this, some kind of legend? A ghost story from the Pentagon?" Nobody laughed. That was the moment his face changed, just slightly, the first pale edge of realization. Not because he understood the nickname. Because he understood he was alone in how he was handling it. Frank folded his napkin and laid it beside his plate. "I served in Vietnam," he said. "Different Navy, different century. But I stayed in touch with enough people over the years to know when a name is said with a certain kind of caution." I looked down at my water glass. There are moments when you want to disappear, and people always assume it's because you're ashamed. Most of the time it's the opposite. Most of the time it's because you know that once a room starts looking at you a certain way, they stop seeing the ordinary parts. They stop seeing the woman who forgot to bring the pie server she promised, or the one who sat in her car for 10 minutes gathering the nerve to come inside. They start seeing a story instead. And stories are dangerous things when they stop belonging to you. Frank went on. "I heard that name years ago, not from the news, not from television, in conversations where people didn't use names lightly." Mark shifted in his chair. "You're making this sound ridiculous." "Am I?" Mark opened his mouth, then closed it. Jenna sat down slowly, not eating, not touching her wine. "Evie," she said softer now, "is this real, the nickname?" "Yes." Her brow furrowed. "Why never mention it?" I gave a tired smile. "Because this is dinner, Jenna, not a deposition." That got a few uneasy smiles around the table. Not laughter exactly, more relief that the world still contained normal rhythms. But Mark wasn't ready to let it settle. "So what, I'm supposed to apologize because she has some tough-sounding nickname from work?" I turned to him then, really turned enough that he had no choice but to meet my eyes. "You don't owe me awe," I said. "You owe people respect before you decide they're lying." That shut him up. Not because I raised my voice, I didn't. At my age and after the life I've lived, I've learned that a steady tone can shame a person more effectively than a shout ever could. Frank nodded once almost to himself. "That's right," he said. "And for what it's worth, son, some names aren't bragging. They're warning labels." The room went quiet again. Not frozen this time, just listening. Outside headlights moved across the front window as a neighbor pulled into a driveway. Somewhere upstairs a toilet flushed. Real life kept going, which somehow made the whole thing feel more grounded, not less. That's how these moments happen in America. Not on a battlefield, not in a movie. At a polished dining table in Northern Virginia beside a bowl of mashed potatoes and a half-finished basket of rolls. Mark looked at his plate for a while before speaking. "I wasn't trying to insult you," he muttered. "I believe that," I said. He looked up surprised. I continued, "But not trying and not doing are two different things." That seemed to reach him more than Frank's sharpness had. People over 60 know this well. Pride doesn't usually break all at once. It gives a little first, then a little more. Frank leaned back, his expression easing just a fraction. "You asked her to perform," he said. "That's what you did. And some people have paid too high a price to do that for the amusement of a dinner table." Nobody moved for several seconds. Then Aunt Louise reached for the green beans and quietly passed them to Jenna, as if mercy could start with something as simple as resuming a meal. It nearly worked. But Mark looked at Frank and asked the question that kept the whole thing from settling. "How do you know that name?" Frank's eyes came back to me. And I knew before he ever opened his mouth that the evening was about to go much deeper than I had wanted. Frank didn't answer right away. At his age, silence wasn't hesitation. It was judgment. He was deciding what belonged in that room and what didn't. That alone told me plenty about the man. Most people, once they think they know something unusual, hurry to show it. Frank was old enough to understand that information has weight. I saved him the trouble. "You don't have to explain it," I said. His eyes stayed on mine. Maybe not, but maybe I should. Mark gave a short exhale through his nose, not quite a laugh this time, more a sign that his patience was wearing thin. "This is unbelievable." "No," Frank said. "It's very believable, that's the problem." The room had shifted into one of those strange family moments where everyone feels trapped between politeness and truth. Jenna looked like she wanted to smooth everything over with dessert and a subject change. Aunt Louise kept folding and unfolding her napkin. Someone near the far end of the table took a sip of water just to have something to do with their hands. Frank rested his forearms on the table. I spent 30 years after Vietnam working around veterans organizations, military charities, and a few federal contractors, he said. You hear things, not gossip, just enough to know which stories carry weight. Mark frowned. So this is hearsay. Frank ignored that. Every now and then, a name came up. Never in detail, never in a way that invited questions. Just a shorthand among people who understood what it meant when a mission went bad and somebody still brought people home. My jaw tightened. I hated hearing it put that way. Not because it was wrong exactly. Because it was incomplete. People like clean versions of ugly things, especially at a dinner table. Jenna looked at me almost apologetically. Evie, is any of that true? I kept my voice even, some of it. Mark caught on to that immediately, some of it. That means enough, Frank said. Mark leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. It was the same posture he'd worn when I first came in, but it fit him differently now. Less confidence, more defense. I'm sorry, he said, though he didn't sound sorry yet. I just have a hard time with this. She comes to dinner, barely says 10 words, and suddenly everybody's acting like she's some kind of secret war hero. I looked straight at him. I didn't ask anybody to do that. No, he said, but you could clear it up. That was the first honest thing he'd said all night. He didn't want drama, he wanted certainty. People his age and younger often think certainty is their birthright. Folks over 60 usually know better. They've lived long enough to understand that sometimes the truth comes in jagged pieces and you either respect the edges or you get cut. Frank spoke before I did. You want her to satisfy your curiosity, he said. That's not the same thing as clearing it up. Mark's face reddened. I want to know if we're all being played. That landed harder than he meant it to. I could tell from the way Jenna closed her eyes for a second. I should have been angry. Maybe 10 years earlier I would have been. But anger takes energy, and by 35 I'd already spent too much of mine on things that mattered more. So I told him the truth. I'm not playing anything I said, and I'm not interested in convincing you. He looked at me as if that answer frustrated him even more than if I'd snapped back. Then why say it? He asked. Mad dog. Why not just brush it off? Because you asked. Frank gave the smallest nod, like that answer was exactly what he expected. Aunt Louise spoke up carefully. Frank, what did you hear exactly? He was quiet a moment, enough to remember the name. That's not an answer, Mark said. No, Frank replied, it's the answer you're getting. A younger cousin at the far end of the table, a boy in his 20s named Caleb, cleared his throat. Was it like from Afghanistan or something? I looked at him. He had that expression younger people sometimes wear around military stories, half respectful, half shaped by movies and headlines. He wasn't mocking, just unsteady in his understanding. Overseas, I said. That narrows it down, Mark muttered. Frank turned on him with surprising force. Would you listen to yourself? Mark stared back. I'm just asking questions. No, you're trying to win. That took the air out of him. It also settled something in me. Frank wasn't defending a myth. He was defending the principle that some people had earned the right not to be prodded for entertainment. Jenna looked from him to me. Evie, I really didn't know. I mean, I knew you served. I knew it was serious. But I didn't. You weren't supposed to, I said gently. Her eyes softened. Why? I glanced down at my plate. My food had gone cold and I hadn't noticed. Because when you tell civilians too much, they either turn it into a movie or they back away from you in church parking lots. Nobody had a response to that. In a room full of family, that may have been the loneliest sentence I'd spoken in years. Frank broke the silence. There was talk of a rescue operation, he said carefully. That's all I ever heard. A bad situation. Bad enough that people who knew better stopped talking when the name came up. Mark's mouth tightened. So there's no proof. I looked at him steadily. You need proof because you still think this is about status. He opened his mouth, but I kept going. It's not. That nickname wasn't something I picked. It wasn't a trophy. It was what people started calling me after a mission that cost too much. That did it. Not in some dramatic movie way. No gasps, no dropped glasses. Just the room settling around the fact that whatever this was, it wasn't fun anymore. Frank's voice turned quieter. That's what I figured. Mark looked at me for a long moment. For the first time since the evening began, his expression lost that smug edge entirely. In its place was something more human and less flattering. Embarrassment. Maybe even fear. Not fear of me exactly, fear of having walked into deep water thinking it was shallow. Jenna reached over and put a hand on his wrist, but he didn't look at her. He kept looking at me. I didn't know, he said. I believed him. That didn't make the damage disappear, but it mattered. Most family wounds don't begin with cruelty, they begin with carelessness. Frank leaned back and exhaled slowly. Then now you do. And with that, the whole table seemed to understand that the evening had crossed a line it wouldn't uncross. Not into spectacle, into truth. Mark swallowed once and said quieter now. What happened on that mission? I looked down at my hands. I hadn't planned on telling any of them. But some nights choose their own direction. I didn't answer Mark right away. There are questions that sound simple but aren't. Questions that pull on threads you've spent years tucking away. You don't refuse them because you're hiding something. You hesitate because once you start, you can't decide how much of it comes out. And once it's out, it doesn't belong to you anymore. The room waited. I could feel it, not pressure exactly, but expectation. Even Frank, who understood more than the others, didn't stop it this time. He just watched, steady and quiet, like a man who knew that sometimes truth has to be spoken in its own time. I rested my hands flat on the table. It wasn't one moment I said, "It never is." Mark didn't interrupt. That alone told me something had shifted. It started like most operations do, I went on. Information came in, incomplete, time-sensitive. There were civilians involved, Americans, contractors, aid workers. Wrong place at the wrong time. Caleb leaned forward slightly, but he didn't speak. We were told it was a recovery mission, I said. In and out, fast, controlled. I let out a quiet breath. That's what it was supposed to be. Jenna's fingers tightened around her napkin. What happened? She asked softly. I looked at her, not Mark this time. We got there, I said, and it wasn't what we were told. That sentence hung in the air longer than I expected. Frank gave a small knowing nod. The layout was wrong, I continued. The number of people inside was wrong. The level of resistance wrong. You plan for variables, but there's a difference between variables and being set up for something you weren't prepared to handle. Mark swallowed, eyes fixed on me now. Was it an ambush, he asked. Not exactly, I said, but close enough that it didn't matter. I could feel the memory pulling sharper now. Sounds, heat, the way time stretches and collapses at the same moment. We went in anyway, I said. Because that's the job. You don't get to stand outside and argue with bad intel while people are waiting inside. Nobody moved. We made contact, I said. Fast, loud, confusing. You don't see things clearly in those moments. You see shapes, movement. You hear voices, but they don't always make sense. I paused. You rely on training, on the people next to you. My voice slowed. And when something goes wrong, you feel it before you understand it. Jenna covered her mouth. What do you mean? She whispered. I looked down at the table. It means someone doesn't answer when they should, I said. It means a position that was supposed to be covered isn't. It means you realize in a split second that the plan you had is gone. Frank's eyes dropped briefly. He didn't need more explanation. Mark shifted in his chair, quieter now. Did you lose people? Yes. I didn't soften it. There are things you don't dress up. The room seemed to shrink around that word. Aunt Louise whispered, "Oh my Lord." I continued, not because I wanted to, but because stopping there would have turned it into something worse, something half-told and misunderstood. The first attempt failed, I said. We had to pull back. Mark frowned. You left. We had to, I said. We were compromised, injured, outnumbered. His expression tightened like he was trying to reconcile what that meant. And the hostages, he asked. I held his gaze. We left them there. Silence. Not uncomfortable this time. Heavy. Real. Caleb spoke before he could stop himself. But you went back. I looked at him. Yes. Frank's jaw shifted slightly. He already knew that part. Mark leaned forward, elbows on the table again, but this time there was no arrogance in it. You went back alone, he asked. I didn't answer immediately. Because that was the part people always focused on. Not the failure. Not the cost. Just the decision that came after. It wasn't supposed to happen that way, I said. No one plans to go back alone. That's not how it works. Then how did it happen? Jenna asked. I took a breath. Because leaving them didn't sit right, I said. That was the simplest version. The truest one, too. There are moments, I continued, when you can follow orders and still know you're going to carry something for the rest of your life. And there are moments when you step outside of that and accept a different kind of consequence. Mark stared at me. You disobeyed orders, he said. Yes. The word landed without apology. Jenna looked stunned. Evie. I knew what I was doing, I said. And I knew what it could cost me, not just professionally. Frank spoke quietly. But you went anyway. Yes. No one asked why again? They didn't need to. I leaned back slightly in my chair. It wasn't heroic, I said. It wasn't clean. It was messy and loud and uncertain, and the only reason I'm sitting here talking about it is because it worked. I let that sit for a second. Not perfectly, I added. Nothing like that ever is. Mark's voice came out lower now. You got them out. Yes. And that's why they called you. He stopped himself before finishing the sentence. I shook my head slightly. That's why they called me that, I said. Because I didn't stop. Frank closed his eyes briefly. Not in admiration. In understanding. That's not something people say lightly, he murmured. No, I said, it's not. The room had changed. Completely. Nobody was leaning back casually anymore. Nobody was smiling politely. The distance between people, the safe, comfortable distance that keeps conversations easy, was gone. Now we were all sitting in something closer. Something harder. Mark ran a hand over his face. I thought, he began, then stopped. What I asked? He looked at me, and for the first time since I'd met him, there was no performance in his expression. I thought you were exaggerating, he said quietly. I know. That answer surprised him. You do? Yes? Why didn't you say anything? I gave a small, tired smile. Because people don't hear things until they're ready to. Frank nodded once more. That's true. Jenna reached across the table, her hand stopping just short of mine before she seemed unsure if she should touch it. Evie, I'm sorry, she said. For what? For not knowing, for all of this. I shook my head. You weren't supposed to know, I said again. That part hadn't changed. But something else had. The room wasn't judging anymore. It was listening. And Mark wasn't trying to win anymore. He was trying to understand. That was a start. But we weren't finished yet. Because understanding what happened is one thing. Understanding what it cost. That's something else entirely. Nobody spoke for a while after that. You could feel the weight of what had just been said settling into the room like dust after something breaks. Not chaotic, just different, heavier. I picked up my glass and took a slow sip of water. It grounded me. Brought me back to the table, to the people sitting there, to the fact that this wasn't a briefing room or a debrief or a report that would disappear into a file. This was family. Or something trying to become it. Mark cleared his throat. So, you just decided to go back, he asked. There was no challenge in his voice now, just disbelief, quiet searching. I didn't decide it the way you're thinking, I said. It wasn't a speech or a moment, it was a realization. What kind of realization, he asked. That I wasn't done, I said. He frowned. But you said the mission failed. It did. And you were ordered to pull out. Yes. He shook his head slowly. Then how do you justify going back? I looked at him carefully. I don't, I said. That stopped him. I don't justify it, I repeated. I live with it. That's the part most people don't expect. They want a clean answer, a reason they can agree with, something that makes everything line up neatly in their minds. But life doesn't work that way. Not at 35, not after enough years of seeing how decisions ripple outward. Frank spoke quietly. There's a difference between justification and responsibility. I nodded once, exactly. Mark leaned back, absorbing that. So you went back, knowing you might not come out, he said. Yes. Why? I held his gaze. Because they wouldn't, I said. That landed differently than anything else I'd said. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just final. Jenna's eyes filled slightly, though she blinked it back. Aunt Louise reached for her hand under the table. Mark looked down at his plate again, then back up. He stopped searching for words. I've never had to make a decision like that. No, I said gently, most people don't. Frank let out a long breath. And that's something to be grateful for. Mark nodded faintly. I think I treated it like a story, he admitted, like something you'd tell at a bar, something exciting. That's how it looks from the outside, I said. And from the inside, I paused. From the inside, I said it's mostly waiting, and hoping the people next to you make it through the next 10 seconds. Nobody moved. The clock on the wall ticked loudly now. I hadn't noticed it before. Mark rubbed his hands together. I shouldn't have pushed you like that, he said, at the start. No, I said. He winced slightly at how direct that sounded. Then I softened it just a little. But you didn't know what you were pushing on, I added. That doesn't make it okay, he said. No, I agreed, but it makes it understandable. That seemed to matter to him. People his age, mid-40s, I guessed, still live in that space where they want to be, right? But they're starting to understand the value of being decent instead. Frank looked at him. What matters is what you do with it now. Mark nodded slowly. Then he looked at me again. I'm sorry, he said. This time it was different. No hesitation. No performance. Just a man admitting he'd misjudged someone sitting across from him. I studied him for a second. Then I nodded. Thank you. That was enough. We didn't need a bigger moment than that. Reconciliation, I've learned, doesn't come with applause. It comes quietly in small sentences that people mean. Jenna exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for the last 10 minutes. Okay, she said, forcing a small smile. Can we maybe try to eat before everything gets cold? A few people chuckled softly. It wasn't a return to normal, but it was a step toward something livable. Plates were passed again. Someone poured more water. The ordinary rhythm of dinner resumed, though more gently now, like everyone was aware of how quickly things could shift. Mark reached for the serving dish nearest him and passed it to me without a word. A small gesture. But a real one. Thanks, I said. He nodded. Across the table, Caleb asked Frank a quiet question about his time in Vietnam, and for the first time that evening the focus moved away from me. I was grateful for that. Not because I wanted to hide. Because I wanted to be part of the room again. Not the center of it. Frank answered Caleb slowly, choosing his words with care, not glorifying, not dramatizing, just telling the truth the way older Americans often do, plain steady without trying to impress anyone. I listened. And for the first time since I'd walked in, I felt something loosen in my chest. Not comfort exactly, but something close. Jenna leaned toward me. I really am glad you came, she said softly. I looked at her. I almost didn't, I admitted. She smiled. I'm glad you did anyway. Me too, I said. And I meant it. Because as uncomfortable as the evening had been, it had done something important. It had stripped away the surface. The assumptions. The easy judgments. What was left wasn't perfect. But it was honest. Mark cleared his throat again after a while. Can I ask you one more thing, he said. I glanced at him. You can ask. He hesitated, then said, Do you hate that nickname? That question surprised me. Not because of what it was, because of how he asked it. Carefully. Respectfully. I thought about it for a moment. Then I answered the truth. I don't hate it, I said. But I don't carry it the way other people think. What do you mean? I rested my hands on the table. It reminds me of what didn't go right, I said. Not just what did. Frank nodded almost to himself. That's the part civilians never see, he murmured. I looked at Mark. It's not something I bring to dinner, I said. He gave a small understanding nod. Yeah, he said quietly, I see that now. Outside, the sky had gone fully dark. The reflections in the window showed us all sitting there, older faces, younger ones, a mix of lives and histories that had just for a moment collided. Not perfectly. But honestly, and sometimes at this stage of life, that's enough. Dinner didn't go back to what it had been. It couldn't. But it settled into something better. Quieter, maybe. More deliberate. Like everyone at the table had been reminded that the people sitting across from them carried more than just polite conversation. Frank leaned back in his chair, his hands resting lightly on the armrests now instead of gripping the table. He looked older than he had an hour earlier, but not weaker, just more present. Caleb asked him something about where he had served, and Frank answered without embellishment. No dramatic pauses, no heroic framing, just dates, places, and the kind of details that matter more the older you get. I found myself listening closely. There's a kind of language veterans share even across generations. Not words exactly, more like the way things are said, the way certain moments are left unspoken because they don't need explaining. Jenna eventually stood and began clearing plates. "I'll get dessert started," she said, her voice a little brighter now, trying to bring warmth back into the room. "I'll help," I said, pushing my chair back. She shook her head. "You stay. You've done enough for one night." There was a softness in her tone that hadn't been there before. Respect. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind that stays. I sat back down. Mark watched Jenna disappear into the kitchen, then looked at me. "Hey," he said low enough that only I could hear. I turned slightly toward him. "Yeah." He hesitated. Then almost awkwardly he said I meant what I said earlier. "I know," I replied. He nodded, then added, "I think I've spent a lot of my life thinking I understood people just by listening to them talk for a few minutes." I gave a faint smile. "That's most people." "Yeah," he said, "but I was wrong tonight." There wasn't much to say to that. So I just said that happens. He let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but softer than before. "Not like this," he said. Across the table, Frank looked over at us, not interrupting, just aware. He had the look of someone who'd seen this kind of moment before, the kind that doesn't come often but matters when it does. Mark leaned forward slightly. "Can I ask you something else?" he said. "You've been doing that all night," I replied. This time there was a hint of humor in my voice. He caught it and smiled just a little. "Yeah, but this one's different." I nodded. "Go ahead." He lowered his voice. "How do you come back from that?" he asked. I knew exactly what he meant. Not the mission. Not the nickname. The life that comes after. I took a moment before answering. "You don't come back the same," I said. He frowned slightly. "Then what do you do?" "You build something new," I said, piece by piece. You figure out what still fits and what doesn't. That sounds hard. It is. Frank spoke from across the table. But it's also necessary. Mark glanced at him, then back at me. "Do people help?" he asked. I thought about that. "Some do," I said. "Some don't know how." "And tonight," he asked. I met his eyes. "Tonight helped," I said. That seemed to mean more to him than anything else I'd said. He sat back, absorbing it. Jenna returned with a tray of dessert apple pie, still warm, with small bowls of vanilla ice cream. The smell filled the room, cutting through the heaviness in a way that felt almost symbolic. "Okay," she said, setting everything down. "I think we've all earned this." There were a few soft laughs. Plates were passed again. This time the conversation moved more naturally, not forced, not overly careful, just respectful. Aunt Louise asked me where I was living now. Caleb talked about his job. Someone mentioned the wedding again, and this time it didn't feel like a distraction. It felt like a reminder that life keeps moving forward even after difficult moments. I answered when spoken to. Listened when others shared. And slowly I stopped feeling like an outsider sitting at the table. After dessert I stood. "I'm going to step outside for a minute," I said. Jenna looked at me. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," I said. "Just need some air." She nodded. "Take your time." I walked out through the front door and onto the porch. The night air was cool, quiet, a soft breeze moving through the trees lining the street. For a moment I just stood there. No voices, no questions. Just the sound of distant traffic and the faint rustle of leaves. I rested my hands on the porch railing. This was the part people don't talk about. Not the mission. Not the aftermath. But the in-between moments. The ones where you stand still and try to feel like you belong somewhere that doesn't require you to be anything other than human. The door opened behind me. I didn't turn. I already knew who it was. Frank stepped out beside me. He didn't say anything right away. Just stood there looking out at the quiet street. After a minute he said, "You handled that well." "I didn't handle it," I said. "It just happened." He nodded slightly. "That's usually how it goes." We stood in silence for a while. Then he said, "Coming home isn't easy." No, I agreed. Never was, he added. Different wars, same problem. I glanced at him. You still feel it? I asked. He gave a faint smile. Some days more than others. I understood that. He looked at me then. But nights like this help, he said. I considered that. Yeah, I said, they do. He nodded once. Then he said something that stayed with me. People don't need to understand everything he said. They just need to be willing to respect what they don't understand. I let that settle. Then I said, that's enough. He smiled. Yes, he said, it is. We stood there a little longer. Not talking. Not needing to. Inside I could hear voices again, softer now, warmer. Family. Not perfect, but real. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like something worth staying for. Morning came quietly. I woke up in the guest room with that unfamiliar stillness that only happens in someone else's house. No alarms, no radios, no distant hum of engines. Just sunlight filtering through the blinds and the faint sound of movement downstairs. For a few seconds I didn't remember where I was. Then it all came back. The dinner. The silence. Mark's face when he realized. Frank's voice cutting through the room. The way everything shifted after that. I sat up slowly, letting my feet rest on the edge of the bed before standing. My body still carried habits from another life-wake-assess move. Even in a quiet Virginia home, those instincts didn't just disappear. But they softened. Little by little. I got dressed and stepped into the hallway. The house already smelled like coffee. That helped. Downstairs, Jenna was in the kitchen, standing by the stove with a mug in her hand. She turned when she saw me. Good morning, she said, smiling. Morning. You sleep okay? I did, I said, better than I expected. She nodded like she understood that meant more than just rest. I made coffee, she said, and there's some breakfast if you want. Coffee sounds good. I poured myself a cup and leaned lightly against the counter. For a moment we just stood there sharing the quiet. Then she said, last night. I looked at her. I'm really glad you stayed, she finished. So am I. She hesitated. I hope it didn't feel like we were putting you on display. It didn't, I said. That wasn't entirely true at first, but by the end it had changed. I think we all learned something, she added. I gave a small nod. Yeah. Mark walked in then slower than usual, like he'd been thinking before coming downstairs. He looked at me, then at Jenna, then back at me. Morning, he said. Morning? He stepped over to the coffee pot, poured himself a cup, then stood there for a second longer than necessary. Finally he turned. I've been thinking about what you said, he told me. Which part? All of it, he said, but mostly the part about not bringing that nickname to dinner. I held his gaze. That one tends to stick with people. He nodded. Yeah, it should. There was a pause. Then he said, I talked to Uncle Frank this morning. That didn't surprise me. And I asked. He told me I was lucky. I raised an eyebrow slightly. Lucky. Lucky I learned that lesson at a dinner table, he said. And not somewhere it would have cost me more. Frank would say something like that. Sounds about right, I said. Mark let out a small breath. I meant what I said last night, he added, about being wrong. I know. He looked at me for a moment, then said, I don't think I've ever really thought about what people carry with them. Not like that. That's most people, I said again. He gave a faint smile. Yeah, but I'd like to be better about it. That was the difference. Not perfection. Willingness. That's enough, I said. Jenna watched the exchange quietly, her expression soft. You two want breakfast, she asked, breaking the moment just enough to keep it from getting too heavy again. Sure, Mark said. I nodded. Yeah. Later that morning we sat at the same table. Same chairs. Same sunlight coming through the windows. But it felt different. Not tense. Not fragile. Just settled. Conversation came easier. Not forced, not careful, just real. Mark asked me about where I planned to go next, and this time it wasn't curiosity trying to prove something. It was interest. I told him I was considering staying in Virginia for a while, maybe working with a veterans support group, maybe something quieter. That sounds like you, Jenna said. I smiled faintly. I think it might be. Frank joined us halfway through breakfast, moving a little slower than the night before, but steady as ever. He took his seat, looked around the table, and gave a small nod. Better morning, he said. Yes, sir, Mark replied. Frank looked at him for a second, then smiled just slightly. "Good," he said. That was all. But it carried weight. By late morning, it was time for me to go. I stood near the front door, my bag in hand. Jenna hugged me again. This time I returned it without hesitation. "Come back for the wedding," she said. "I will." Mark stepped forward next. He hesitated for half a second, then held out his hand. I took it. "Drive safe," he said. "I will." Then after a brief pause he added, "And thank you." "For what?" "For not shutting me out," he said. I nodded once. "You gave me a reason not to." That seemed to stay with him. Frank walked me to the door. As I stepped outside, he said, "You did more than you think last night." I looked at him. "I just told the truth," I said. "That's usually enough," he replied. Then he added, "Take care of yourself." "I will." I got into my car and sat there for a moment, just like the night before. Same seat. Same steering wheel. But not the same feeling. The house behind me wasn't just a place I'd passed through anymore. It was somewhere I could come back to. I started the engine. As I pulled away, I glanced once in the rearview mirror. Mark and Jenna stood in the doorway, Frank just behind them. 3 different generations. 3 different lives. All changed just a little by one dinner. I don't think about the nickname much anymore. Mad Dog was never something I carried with pride. It was something I carried because I had to. But that night reminded me of something important. People don't need to understand everything you've been through. They just need to meet you with respect when they realize they don't. And sometimes if you're lucky, they learn. And they change. And so do you. If you've ever misjudged someone, or been misjudged yourself, maybe you understand how small moments can leave a lasting mark. If this story meant something to you, I hope you'll take a moment to reflect on the people around your own table, the ones you think you know. And maybe share this story with someone who might need the reminder. Because respect once given honestly has a way of coming back around. And those quiet lessons, they're the ones that stay. The house is sold, you're homeless now. My mother-in-law said it like she was announcing the weather. Calm, cold, satisfied. She stood beside my husband on our front porch, holding a stack of divorce papers against her chest, while the late afternoon Colorado wind pushed strands of silver hair across her face. Daniel wouldn't even look me in the eye. I remember staring at both of them from the driveway, still holding my purse, still smiling from what had happened less than an hour earlier. $7 million. My grandmother Eleanor had left me $7 million and her estate in Aspen. I had spent the entire drive home crying happy tears behind the wheel like some foolish teenage girl. I kept imagining Daniel lifting me off the ground when I told him. I imagined us finally breathing again after years of financial stress. Instead, my husband stood on the porch beside his mother like a stranger waiting to evict a tenant. "The movers already came," Patricia continued. "Your things are in storage." I blinked slowly. "What?" Daniel finally spoke, but his voice sounded rehearsed. "It's over, Claire. Over. 27 years of marriage reduced to 2 words spoken by a man who once drove 6 hours through a snowstorm just to bring me soup when I had pneumonia." I looked past them toward the house. Our house. Or at least the place I had believed was ours. The flower pots I planted in spring were gone. The porch swing Daniel built 10 years earlier was missing too. Even the curtains had changed. That's when I realized this hadn't happened suddenly. This had been planned. Carefully. Quietly. Probably for weeks. Maybe longer. Patricia stepped down one porch stair and held out the papers toward me. "You should sign while things are still civil." Civil. I almost laughed. Instead, I asked the question that mattered most. "When were you going to tell me?" Daniel rubbed his forehead like I was exhausting him. "Claire, don't make this harder than it has to be." Harder. I thought about the leather folder still sitting in my car containing the copy of Eleanor's will. I thought about the attorney shaking my hand that morning. I thought about the way my grandmother had smiled during her final weeks whenever Patricia's name came up. Now suddenly that smile made sense. Patricia folded her arms. "You'll land on your feet, women always do." There was something almost impressive about how cruel she could sound while pretending to be practical. I met that woman when I was 34 years old. She hated me before she even knew me. Not openly, of course. Patricia Whitmore was too polished for that. Too country club refined. Too experienced at delivering insults wrapped inside compliments. "Oh, Claire, you're prettier than Daniel's usual type." You're so brave to wear your hair short. You've always been so independent. Some men don't like that forever. Little cuts. Tiny poisons. Year after year. And Daniel always defended her. She doesn't mean it that way. That had become the anthem of our marriage. Patricia looked toward the street impatiently. You really should leave before the buyers arrive. Buyers. The word floated strangely in my head. Then Daniel finally looked directly at me. The house sold 3 days ago. 3 days. 3 days earlier, I had been sitting beside my grandmother's hospital bed, holding her hand while she struggled to breathe. 3 days earlier, my husband was apparently selling our home behind my back. Something inside me should have shattered right then. But strangely, it didn't. Because at that exact moment, another memory surfaced. 3 months earlier, Grandma Eleanor sitting quietly at her kitchen table in Aspen while snow fell outside the windows. Never let other people rush you into signing papers, she had told me. I remembered laughing softly. Grandma, you sound paranoid. No, she said calmly, I sound old. At the time, I thought she was talking about ordinary legal precautions. Now I wasn't so sure. Patricia interrupted my thoughts by shoving the papers closer toward me. You can sign now or later. Makes no difference to us. Us. Not Daniel. Us. That told me everything. This wasn't a marriage ending. This was an extraction. A removal. And Patricia had orchestrated it. Daniel finally sighed. The house was under my name, Claire. Legally, there's nothing you can do. That sentence almost made me smile immediately. Almost. Instead, I asked quietly, You sold it already? Yes. And finalized everything. Daniel nodded once. Patricia smirked. You always were too trusting. There it was. The truth. Not anger. Not heartbreak. Contempt. They thought I was weak. Simple. Manageable. The funny thing is, I probably had been. At least until that morning. At least until Eleanor's attorney slid those documents across the desk. At least until I learned my grandmother had spent years preparing for something I didn't yet fully understand. A strange calm settled over me. The kind of calm people get right before a car crash. Or right after one. I looked up at the porch. At my husband. At the woman who spent nearly 3 decades trying to erase me from her son's life. Then I smiled. A real smile. Daniel frowned immediately. What's so funny? I glanced toward the stack of papers in Patricia's hands. Then toward the house behind them. Toward the house Daniel proudly believed he had sold. And softly, almost gently, I said, Actually, the house you sold belonged to. Neither of them spoke. The wind moved through the trees above us. Patricia's expression shifted slightly for the first time all afternoon. Confusion. Just a flicker. But enough. And standing there in the driveway with the sun dropping behind the mountains, I suddenly realized something important. For the first time in 27 years, I wasn't the one about to lose everything. Patricia's smile disappeared first. Not completely. Just enough for me to notice. The confidence around her eyes tightened slightly while Daniel stared at me like he was trying to solve a math problem in his head. What does that mean, he asked. I didn't answer immediately. Honestly, I wasn't entirely sure myself. Not yet. But I knew enough. And more importantly, they didn't know what I knew. That changed everything. Patricia recovered quickly, of course. Women like her always did. She gave a short, dismissive laugh and handed the divorce papers back to Daniel. Oh, please, she said, don't start with dramatic nonsense. But Daniel kept staring at me. Because after 27 years together, he knew my face. He knew when I was bluffing. And this wasn't bluffing. I slowly walked past them toward the porch steps. Patricia immediately moved sideways to block me. You can't go inside. I looked at her calmly. My coat is still in there. We'll ship it. Ship it. Like I was already dead. For one brief second, anger flashed hot through my chest. Not because of the house, not even because of Daniel. Because of humiliation. Because they had planned this carefully enough to pack my belongings before I even came home from my grandmother's will reading. Daniel finally spoke again. Claire, maybe we should talk privately. Patricia snapped her head toward him immediately. About what? There it was again. Control. She didn't even try to hide it anymore. I suddenly remembered something Grandma Eleanor once told me while we sat together on her Aspen porch drinking tea. When a man stops thinking for himself, watch the woman speaking beside him. At the time, I thought she was simply being old-fashioned. Now those words landed differently. I stepped back away from the porch. That's fine, I said quietly. I don't need the coat. Patricia crossed her arms tightly. Good. Then she added the line she had probably rehearsed all afternoon. You should be grateful Daniel is handling this peacefully. Peacefully. I almost admired the audacity. Daniel finally looked uncomfortable. Not guilty, just uncomfortable. Like a man realizing a dinner reservation might become awkward. That hurt more than yelling would have. Because once upon a time Daniel had loved me deeply. I know he did. We met in 1994 at a 4th of July fundraiser in Denver. He spilled iced tea on my white blouse, spent 20 minutes apologizing, then asked me to dinner before the night ended. He had kind eyes back then. Warm eyes. The kind that made you feel safe. And for years he really was safe. Until Patricia slowly became the third person in our marriage, not openly. Subtly. Always subtly. She questioned every vacation we took. Every renovation. Every financial decision. Every holiday. When we struggled financially after the recession, Patricia suddenly became even more involved. She helped us refinance, helped organize paperwork, helped Daniel manage accounts. Grandma Eleanor noticed immediately. She inserts herself into your marriage like smoke under a door, she once said. I defended Patricia every time. I defended Daniel too. That's what wives from my generation were taught to do. Protect the marriage. Keep peace. Absorb discomfort quietly. And slowly, without realizing it, you disappear. The sound of a truck turning onto the street pulled me back into the present. Daniel looked toward the road nervously. A black SUV rolled slowly toward the curb in front of the house. Patricia's expression changed instantly. That's them, she muttered. The buyers. Interesting. I watched Daniel straighten his shirt nervously while Patricia forced another polished smile onto her face. The SUV parked. 2 men stepped out. One was younger, probably an attorney. The other looked around 70. Expensive coat, silver hair, calm posture. He carried himself like someone accustomed to entering tense rooms without fear. The older man looked directly at me first. Not Daniel. Not Patricia. Me. Then he glanced toward the house. Interesting timing, he said. Daniel quickly stepped forward, holding out his hand. Daniel Whitmore. We spoke on the phone. The older man shook it briefly. Walter Bishop. His attorney opened a leather folder beside him. Patricia immediately shifted into hostess mode. We're just finishing a family matter. Walter's eyes rested on the divorce papers in Daniel's hands. Yes, he said calmly, I can see that. Something about his tone made my stomach tighten. He turned toward me again. You must be Claire. I nodded slowly. Walter studied me carefully for several seconds. Then he said something that changed the entire atmosphere instantly. Your grandmother spoke very highly of you. Daniel froze. Patricia blinked hard. And suddenly, the air felt different. Walter reached into his coat pocket and removed a folded envelope. Cream-colored. My grandmother's handwriting. I recognized it instantly. My heart skipped. Walter held the envelope carefully between 2 fingers. She asked me to give you this personally, he said, but only under specific circumstances. Nobody spoke. Even Patricia stayed silent now. Walter continued calmly. She said if this house was ever sold without your full knowledge. He paused, then looked directly at Daniel. There would likely be confusion about ownership. Daniel laughed nervously. What confusion? Walter didn't even glance at him. Instead, he handed me the envelope. My hands trembled slightly as I took it. I stared at Eleanor's handwriting across the front. For Claire, if Patricia finally gets her way. A cold wave moved slowly through my body. Not fear. Recognition. Grandma knew. Somehow, she knew. Daniel stepped closer now. Claire, what is this? I looked up at him. Really looked at him. At the man I spent almost 30 years trusting. Then I looked at Patricia. And for the very first time since meeting her, I saw fear behind her eyes. Real fear. Not social embarrassment. Not irritation. Fear. Walter's attorney quietly opened another folder. I believe he said calmly before anyone moves into this property, we should discuss the trust agreement connected to the estate. Trust agreement. Daniel's face lost color instantly. Patricia whispered, What trust? And standing there beside the driveway while evening shadows stretched across the lawn, I realized my grandmother Eleanor hadn't simply left me money. She had left me protection. Nobody spoke for several seconds after the words trust agreement left the attorney's mouth. The neighborhood suddenly felt too quiet. A dog barked somewhere down the street. Wind rustled through the pine trees lining the sidewalk. Across the road, Mrs. Hargrove was watering her roses, pretending not to stare. Daniel swallowed hard. I think there's been some misunderstanding. Walter Bishop calmly removed his gloves. No, he said. I don't believe there has. Patricia stepped forward immediately, forcing a laugh that sounded painfully artificial now. This is absurd. Daniel legally owned this property. The younger attorney finally spoke. Partially, he corrected. Partially. I watched Daniel's face carefully. That single word frightened him more than anything else so far. Patricia noticed too. She turned toward him sharply. What does that mean? Daniel didn't answer. Walter looked toward me gently. Mrs. Harper, would you like to open the letter now? I nodded slowly. My fingers trembled as I unfolded the envelope. The paper smelled faintly of Eleanor's perfume, lavender and cedarwood. For one painful second, I forgot the house, forgot Daniel, forgot Patricia. All I could think about was my grandmother sitting alone in her Aspen study during her final weeks, knowing she was dying while quietly preparing for this exact moment. I unfolded the letter carefully. Claire, if you are reading this, then I was right to worry. I stopped breathing for a second. Walter remained silent while Daniel shifted impatiently beside the porch. I continued reading. You always believed love could fix dishonesty. That was your mother's weakness too. A lump rose painfully in my throat. My mother died when I was 19. Eleanor rarely spoke about her directly. The letter continued. Daniel is not an evil man, but weak men become dangerous when stronger people whisper in their ears long enough. My eyes lifted instinctively toward Patricia. She looked furious now. Give me that, she snapped. Walter's attorney stepped between us immediately. Number. Patricia froze. Probably not used to hearing that word. Daniel rubbed both hands over his face. This is insane. No, Walter replied calmly again. What's insane is selling property connected to an active trust without understanding the legal structure. Daniel stared at him. What trust? Walter exchanged a brief glance with the attorney. Then the attorney opened the folder fully. 6 years ago, he explained Mrs. Eleanor Bennett quietly transferred a protected ownership percentage connected to this property after assisting with Mr. Whitmore's financial liabilities. My mind flashed backward instantly. 6 years earlier, Daniel's construction business had nearly collapsed after 2 terrible contracts and a lawsuit involving faulty roofing materials. We almost lost everything. Daniel spent months panicking about debt collectors' loans and refinancing. Then suddenly, everything stabilized. When I asked how, he told me Patricia had helped arrange financing. But now another memory surfaced. Grandma Eleanor calling me late one evening. Don't worry about the house, she had said softly. I handled it. At the time, I assumed she meant emotional support. Now I understood. She literally handled it. Daniel looked pale. What percentage? The attorney answered immediately. Enough to complicate unauthorized sale proceedings. Patricia exploded. Oh, for God's sake, Daniel, what did you sign? There were hundreds of pages, he snapped back. And you signed them without reading. You told me the refinancing had to happen fast. The silence afterward was almost embarrassing, because suddenly the truth stood naked in front of all of us. They weren't masterminds. They were greedy amateurs. Walter adjusted his coat calmly while Patricia's composure began cracking apart piece by piece. She pointed at me furiously. She knew about this. I didn't, I said honestly. And I truly hadn't. Not fully. But Grandma had. That realization settled deep inside me now. Eleanor had spent years watching quietly while Patricia maneuvered through our lives like a woman rearranging furniture inside someone else's house. And she planned accordingly. Daniel looked at me desperately now. Claire, listen, we can figure this out. Interesting. 10 minutes earlier, I was homeless. Now suddenly we existed again. I folded Grandma's letter carefully. You already figured things out, Daniel. That's not fair? I laughed softly before I could stop myself. Not cruelly. Just tired. You sold our house while I was burying my grandmother. Patricia interrupted immediately. It was legally his house. Walter finally looked directly at her. No, he said calmly. That assumption may become very expensive. Patricia's face went white. The younger attorney closed the folder. At minimum, the buyers were not informed about active trust entanglements connected to the property. Daniel looked genuinely sick now. Walter spoke carefully, almost kindly. My legal team discovered the issue this afternoon during final review. Patricia crossed her arms tightly. So what now? Walter glanced toward the house. Now he said we pause everything before someone makes this worse. Daniel suddenly turned toward me. You knew this would happen. Number. Then why were you smiling? I looked at him quietly for several seconds. Because the answer had finally become clear. I smiled because for the first time in years, I wasn't trapped anymore. Not financially. Not emotionally. Not inside a marriage where every decision quietly passed through Patricia first. The realization felt strange. Painful. But freeing too. Walter gently motioned toward the letter in my hands. There's more, he said. I looked back down and continued reading. Claire, if Patricia is standing nearby while you read this, then I imagine she still believes money makes people powerful. But real power is patience. And people who underestimate quiet women usually regret it eventually. I could practically hear Eleanor's voice saying the words. Patricia looked furious enough to explode. Daniel suddenly seemed smaller somehow. Older? Walter spoke softly. Your grandmother asked me to help if necessary. Why, I whispered. Walter smiled sadly. Because she loved you. That nearly broke me. Not the money, not the house. That. The simple certainty that someone saw everything happening around me for years, and cared enough to prepare for it. Daniel stepped down from the porch finally. Claire? I held up one hand gently. Number? He stopped immediately, and for the first time since our marriage began, he actually listened. Walter suggested we continue the conversation somewhere private. Patricia objected immediately. We are not sneaking off to some back room over made-up legal nonsense. Walter didn't even react. He simply turned toward me. Claire, it struck me then that nobody had asked what I wanted in a very long time. Not really. Daniel usually decided, Patricia always influenced. And I adapted, smoothed things over, kept peace. That had been my role for decades. But standing there with my grandmother's letter still trembling in my hands, I realized I was tired of peace that only existed when I stayed silent. I'd like to hear the rest, I said. Walter nodded once. There's a hotel lounge about 5 minutes away. Patricia scoffed loudly. Oh, please. But Daniel interrupted her this time. Mom, stop. The word startled both of us. Mom, not Patricia, not mother. A little boy's voice hiding inside a 70-year-old man. Patricia looked offended. Daniel looked exhausted. The younger attorney handed Walter another folder while I slowly walked back toward my car. Daniel followed me halfway down the driveway. Claire, wait. I stopped but didn't turn around immediately. His voice softened. You know I'd never intentionally hurt you. I closed my eyes briefly. There it was again. The careful wording. Not, I didn't hurt you. Just not intentionally. I turned slowly toward him. You sold our house while I was at my grandmother's will reading. His shoulders sagged. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. How was it supposed to happen? He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Because there was no answer that didn't sound ugly. Patricia suddenly called from the porch. Daniel. One word. Sharp enough to cut rope. And like instinct, he looked back at her immediately. That told me everything I needed to know. Again. The hotel lounge was quiet and dimly lit, mostly older couples eating early dinners, and tourists escaping the evening cold. Walter reserved a private corner table near the fireplace while his attorney spread documents carefully across the polished wood. Daniel sat beside me automatically. Patricia sat beside him even faster. Like she was afraid physical distance might weaken her control. I kept Grandma Eleanor's letter folded tightly in my lap. Walter removed his glasses. Before we continue, he said calmly, I want to clarify something. Nobody interrupted him. The sale itself may not be completely invalid. Patricia immediately smirked again. But Walter continued. However, depending on intent, disclosure, and timing, several serious legal complications exist. Daniel rubbed his forehead. What complications? The younger attorney answered. Failure to disclose protected trust interests, potential financial concealment during marital dissolution proceedings, improper transfer timing. Patricia waved her hand dismissively. You lawyers make everything sound dramatic. The attorney looked directly at her. No, ma'am, courts do. That shut her up for a moment. Walter turned toward me gently. Claire, your grandmother requested that this second envelope only be opened if you discovered evidence of betrayal involving the property. My stomach tightened. Second envelope. Of course there was another one. Eleanor had always believed important things deserved layers. She once wrapped my Christmas gifts inside 5 separate boxes just because she enjoyed suspense. Walter slid the envelope toward me. I stared at it silently. My grandmother's handwriting again. For Claire, when the truth finally becomes impossible to ignore. My chest hurt reading that. Because deep down, I think part of me always knew. Not about the house. Not about the divorce. But about Daniel slowly disappearing from our marriage year after year while I pretended not to notice. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside was another handwritten letter. And several photocopied documents. Bank transfers. Property records. Emails. I looked down at the first sentence. Claire. If you are reading this, then Patricia finally overplayed her hand. Patricia shifted uncomfortably beside Daniel. I continued reading silently for several seconds before my breathing slowed completely. Then I looked up at Daniel. You used my inheritance from my mother. He blinked hard. What? I lifted one of the documents. You told me we used your savings during the recession. Patricia suddenly leaned forward. Claire, now wait a minute. Number? The word surprised even me. Patricia froze. I stared directly at Daniel. You used the money my mother left me. He looked trapped now. Cornered. Like a tired man who suddenly realizes every locked door around him was built by his own choices. It was temporary, he muttered weakly. How much? Silence. How much, Daniel? Finally. Almost all of it. The fireplace crackled softly beside us. Somewhere across the lounge, silverware clinked against plates. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life continuing while mine quietly cracked open. My mother left me $80,000 when she died. Not enough to change a life, but enough to matter. Enough to remember her by. Daniel reached toward me carefully. Claire, I was trying to save the business. Patricia immediately jumped in. And that business fed you for years. Walter calmly slid another document across the table. Actually, he said the business losses accelerated after several withdrawals connected to Patricia Whitmore's investment accounts. The silence afterward felt enormous. Daniel slowly turned toward his mother. Patricia's face drained pale. What? Walter adjusted the paper slightly. Mrs. Whitmore encouraged several high-risk investments during the same period Mr. Whitmore claimed financial hardship. Daniel stared at her. You said those accounts were protected. Patricia snapped instantly. They were supposed to be. Supposed to be. There it was, the truth finally dragging itself into daylight. Daniel wasn't innocent. But he wasn't the mastermind either. He was weak. Weak enough to follow the loudest voice in the room. Grandma Eleanor had seen that years before I did. I looked back down at her letter. You cannot save people who willingly hand their conscience to someone else. A tear slid down my cheek before I could stop it. Not because of the money. Because I suddenly realized how long I had been fighting alone for a marriage Daniel stopped protecting years ago. Walter spoke softly. Your grandmother didn't want you destroyed financially after the divorce. Divorce. The word sounded different now. Not like death. Like release. Daniel finally whispered, Claire, I'm sorry. And for the first time all evening, I believed he meant it. But strangely, that no longer changed anything. The strange thing about betrayal is this. Sometimes the pain doesn't arrive all at once. Sometimes it comes quietly, layer by layer, until one final truth makes everything collapse together. That night in the hotel lounge, I watched 27 years of marriage unravel in less than an hour. And oddly enough, I wasn't the person falling apart. Patricia was. You're making me sound like some criminal, she snapped at Walter. Walter remained perfectly calm. I'm making you sound documented. The younger attorney slid another set of papers across the table. Patricia barely looked at them. Daniel did. And as he read, something changed in his face. Shock first, then confusion, then anger. Real anger. Not toward me. Toward her. You moved money out of the business account. Patricia crossed her arms defensively. It was temporary. Daniel laughed once under his breath. A bitter sound. That's what I told Claire. Patricia's eyes narrowed instantly. Don't start blaming me for your decisions. My decisions, Daniel stared at her. You told me Claire would take everything if we waited. And I was protecting you. No, he said quietly. You were protecting yourself. That sentence hung heavily over the table. I sat silently beside them, watching the two people who had spent years operating like a team suddenly turn on each other the moment consequences appeared. Grandma Eleanor used to say, greed is loyal only until fear arrives. Now I understood exactly what she meant. Walter closed one folder calmly. At this point, I strongly recommend everyone retain separate legal counsel. Patricia scoffed. Oh, please, nobody's going to court over this. The younger attorney looked directly at her. Ma'am, there's already enough here for civil litigation. Daniel went pale again. Patricia snapped toward him immediately. Stop looking frightened. I should be frightened. No, you should stay calm and let professionals handle this. Daniel suddenly laughed again, this time louder. Professionals, Mom, you told me this would be easy. Every older couple in the lounge was pretending not to stare now. Patricia lowered her voice sharply. Keep your voice down. But Daniel had finally reached that dangerous, emotional place people arrive at when humiliation becomes stronger than denial. No, he said, you pushed this. Patricia leaned closer. And who signed the papers? You said Claire would never know. You said the trust wasn't important. You said the house was safe. You said a lot of things. Each sentence came out harder, sharper. Years of obedience cracking open all at once. And suddenly I saw something clearly. Daniel had spent his entire life trying to earn Patricia's approval. Even now. Even after everything. Part of him still wanted her to tell him this would somehow be okay. But Patricia wasn't comforting him anymore. Because frightened people stop protecting others. They protect themselves. I quietly folded Grandma Eleanor's letters and placed them back inside my purse. Walter noticed. "You all right?" I nodded slowly. And surprisingly, I was. Not happy. Not untouched. But steady. For years I thought losing my marriage would destroy me. Now I realized something worse had already happened long ago. I had spent decades shrinking myself to keep that marriage alive. The destruction had already happened. I just hadn't called it by its real name. Daniel turned toward me suddenly. "Claire, please say something." I looked at him carefully. At the man who once danced with me barefoot in our kitchen at midnight. The man who held my hand at my mother's funeral. The man who now sat trapped between guilt and fear while his mother silently calculated escape routes beside him. "What do you want me to say?" "That I'm sorry." "You already said that." "I mean it." "I know." That seemed to confuse him more than anger would have. Because guilt feels manageable when the other person screams. Quiet acceptance feels final. Patricia abruptly stood from the table. "This conversation is finished." Walter remained seated. "No, ma'am, it's just beginning." She grabbed her purse aggressively. "I am not sitting here while strangers threaten my family." Family. Interesting word. Because Patricia spent years treating me like an intruder inside hers. Daniel looked up at her. "You took money from the business." Patricia exhaled sharply. "Oh, stop acting shocked. I was trying to protect our future." "You hid it from me. I managed it." "That's not the same thing." Patricia looked at him like he was disappointing her. Daniel, weak men always panic once things become uncomfortable. The sentence hit him hard. I could see it. Because for the first time in his life, he realized she didn't actually love him unconditionally either. She valued usefulness, control, compliance. And now that he had failed publicly, her loyalty was evaporating. Walter slowly stood. "I think tonight has been emotionally exhausting for everyone." He looked toward me. "Claire, my driver can take you to Aspen if you'd like." Patricia laughed coldly. "Of course, send her to her mansion." But the insult landed differently now. Because underneath the bitterness, I heard envy. Real envy. Daniel looked stunned. "You're leaving tonight?" I nodded. "There's nothing left for me here." The words surprised me with their truth, not just the house. Denver itself suddenly felt heavy, filled with memories that no longer belonged to me. Daniel stood quickly. "Claire, wait." His voice cracked slightly. That almost hurt more than everything else. Because once upon a time, I would have stayed. I would have explained. Comforted. Tried again. But Grandma Eleanor's final gift wasn't money. It was clarity. And clarity changes people permanently. Patricia grabbed Daniel's arm. "Let her go." He pulled away from her instantly. For the first time. "Number." Patricia blinked in shock. Daniel looked at me desperately. "Please don't leave like this." I picked up my purse slowly. "You already left first." Silence. Heavy silence. The kind people remember years later. Walter walked me toward the hotel entrance while the younger attorney stayed behind with Daniel and Patricia. Outside, cold mountain air filled my lungs. The night smelled like pine and snow. Walter opened the car door for me gently. Before getting inside, I looked back through the hotel windows one last time. Patricia was speaking furiously. Daniel sat motionless beside her, not defending her anymore, not defending himself either, just staring at the table like a man finally seeing the ruins of his own choices. And for the first time in decades, I felt absolutely certain about walking away. I arrived in Aspen a little after 2 in the morning. Snow covered the long, winding driveway leading toward Eleanor's estate, turning the entire property silver beneath the moonlight. The caretaker, a quiet older man named Benji, opened the gates after Walter called ahead. "Miss Claire," he said gently when I stepped from the car, "I'm sorry about your grandmother." Those words nearly broke me harder than everything else combined. Because for hours, nobody had spoken about Eleanor herself. Only money, property, divorce, ownership. But Grandma Eleanor wasn't paperwork. She was the woman who taught me how to bake peach cobbler. The woman who mailed handwritten birthday cards every single year no matter where I lived. The woman who once drove 12 hours through a snowstorm after my mother died because she refused to let me grieve alone. And now she was gone. The estate looked exactly the same as always. Warm lights glowing through tall windows. Smoke rising softly from the stone chimney. The porch swing creaking gently in the wind. For one strange second, I expected Eleanor to open the front door holding teacups and asking why I took so long getting there. Instead, only silence greeted me. Benji carried my overnight bag inside while I stood alone in the foyer staring at the familiar wooden staircase. "You should get some sleep," he said kindly. But sleep felt impossible. Everything inside me still felt rearranged. So after Benji went upstairs, I wandered slowly through the house instead. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked softly. The kitchen still smelled faintly of cinnamon. A knitted blanket Eleanor kept folded near the fireplace remained exactly where she left it. It felt less like entering a mansion, and more like entering memory itself. I eventually found myself standing inside Eleanor's study, her favorite room. Dark bookshelves, leather chair, soft jazz records stacked near the window. And there, sitting neatly in the center of her desk, was another letter, of course. I laughed quietly to myself through sudden tears. Even dead Grandma Eleanor still had perfect timing. I sat down slowly and opened it. "Claire, if you are reading this from my study, then things became uglier than I hoped." I smiled despite myself. That woman knew everything. The letter continued. "First breathe. You have spent most of your adult life carrying everyone else's emotions before your own. That habit will exhaust you if you let it continue." I leaned back slowly in Eleanor's chair. Outside, snow drifted quietly past the windows. Inside, the house felt calm in a way my own home hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. The letter continued. "You will be tempted to rescue Daniel emotionally. Do not confuse pity with responsibility." That line landed directly in my chest, because she was right. Even after the betrayal, part of me still worried about him. Not romantically, habitually. Women my age were raised to become emotional caretakers. We soothed, we repaired, we absorbed damage quietly. And after enough years, you stop noticing how heavy that becomes. I folded the letter slowly and stared around the room. Then I noticed something else on Eleanor's desk. A leather journal, my name written across the front. I opened it carefully. Inside were years of notes, observations, thoughts, little things Eleanor noticed but rarely said aloud. One page stopped me cold. "Claire apologizes constantly for things that are not her fault." Another, "Daniel watches Patricia before answering difficult questions." Another, "Claire still believes love means endurance." I closed the journal gently. Not because I was angry, because I felt seen. Completely seen. And maybe for the first time in my entire adult life, understood. The next morning, Aspen looked breathtaking beneath fresh snow. I made coffee in Eleanor's kitchen while sunlight spilled across the mountains outside the windows. For the first time in months, my shoulders didn't hurt. I hadn't realized how tense my body became living around constant emotional pressure. By noon, my phone began exploding with missed calls. Daniel. Again. And again. Voicemails. Texts. Emails. I ignored all of them, until one message finally caught my attention. "Please don't let 30 years end like this." I stared at the screen for a long time, then quietly deleted it. Because the truth was, our marriage hadn't ended in one night. It ended slowly, piece by piece, every time he chose silence over honesty. Every time he let Patricia humiliate me to avoid conflict. Every time I accepted less than respect because I thought loyalty required sacrifice. That afternoon, Walter called to update me. The buyers froze everything he explained. "Your husband's attorney is requesting negotiations." "My husband?" Walter chuckled softly. "Sorry, habit." Oddly enough, hearing the word husband now felt unfamiliar, like clothing that no longer fit properly. Walter hesitated briefly before continuing. "There's something else." "What?" "Patricia hired separate counsel this morning." I closed my eyes slowly. Of course she did. She's blaming Daniel. Yes. I sat quietly beside the fireplace while snow fell heavily outside. Then unexpectedly, I started laughing. Not cruelly, not hysterically. Just tired laughter from a woman finally watching years of manipulation collapse under its own weight. Walter laughed softly too. "Your grandmother predicted that part exactly." I'm not surprised. After we hung up, I walked outside onto the porch wrapped in Eleanor's old wool coat. The mountain air stung my lungs beautifully. Everything looked clean. Still, honest. And standing there alone in the silence, I realized something important. I wasn't lonely. Not even a little. For years, I confused companionship with safety. But real safety, real peace, comes from not having to earn basic kindness every single day. That evening, as sunset painted the snow gold and orange across the mountains, I finally stopped mourning my marriage, because deep down, I knew I had actually been grieving it for years. 1 year later, I stood in Eleanor's kitchen watching sunlight spill across the snow-covered mountains, while a blueberry cobbler cooled beside the window. The house smelled like cinnamon and coffee. Peaceful, warm, lived in. For a long time, I thought healing would feel dramatic somehow, like a movie scene where everything suddenly makes sense and all the pain disappears overnight. But healing, at least for me, arrived quietly, in small moments. The first morning I woke up without anxiety twisting inside my stomach. The first evening I realized I hadn't checked my phone waiting for Daniel's mood to determine mine. The first holiday dinner where nobody criticized the way I cooked, dressed, spoke, or laughed. Tiny freedoms. That's what healing really was. Tiny freedoms repeated enough times to become a life. Outside, fresh snow drifted gently across the Aspen property, while guests slowly began arriving for dinner. Nothing extravagant. Just people who genuinely loved me. Benji carried wood toward the fireplace while my old friend Marianne arranged flowers across the dining table. Walter arrived carrying 2 bottles of wine and immediately started arguing with Benji about football. Normal things. Good things. The kind of things I spent years believing would eventually happen inside my marriage if I just tried harder. But some homes never become peaceful because chaos benefits the people creating it. That lesson took me nearly 70 years to understand. Marianne walked into the kitchen, smiling. "You look lighter." I laughed softly. "That obvious?" "Yes." She kissed my cheek gently before lowering her voice. "Have you heard from Daniel?" I nodded once. Twice, actually. The first letter arrived 6 months earlier. Apologies. Regret. Loneliness. The second came shortly before Christmas. Shorter. Sadness replacing excuses. He wrote that Patricia barely spoke to him anymore after the lawsuits began. Several friends disappeared once the scandal spread through their social circles. The construction business eventually collapsed completely under legal debt and public embarrassment. In his final paragraph, he wrote, "Your grandmother understood people better than I ever did." I never answered. Not because I hated him. Strangely enough, I didn't. Time had softened the sharpest parts of my anger. What remained was something quieter. Acceptance. Daniel wasn't destroyed by one terrible decision. He was destroyed slowly by years of weakness. And honestly, so was I. Just differently. For most of my adult life, I confused self-sacrifice with love. I believed enduring unhappiness made me loyal. I believed keeping peace made me wise. I believed forgiving endlessly made me strong. But Eleanor understood something I didn't. Love without respect eventually becomes permission. And permission invites mistreatment. The front door opened again as Walter entered the kitchen, carrying snow across the hardwood floor. "Bad news," he announced dramatically. "Benji still believes the Broncos can recover next season." I laughed harder than I had in years. Real laughter. The kind that rises naturally instead of carefully. Walter smiled warmly, watching me. "You know," he said quietly once Marianne stepped away, "your grandmother would be very proud of you." That nearly made me cry immediately. Not because of the inheritance. Not because of Aspen. Because for the first time, I finally believed it might actually be true. Dinner that evening stretched for hours. Stories. Laughter. Old memories. At one point, Marianne accidentally burned the dinner rolls and everyone teased her so badly she threatened to leave the table forever. Walter spilled wine on his sweater. Benji cheated at cards. Simple things. Beautiful things. And sitting there surrounded by warmth instead of tension, I suddenly understood what Eleanor had really given me. Not money. Not property. Not revenge. She gave me clarity before it was too late to rebuild my life. That was the real inheritance. Later that night, after everyone left, I stepped outside onto the porch, alone, wrapped in Eleanor's old coat. Snow covered the mountains beneath moonlight. The world looked soft and silent. I sat slowly on the porch swing Daniel built years ago. Ironically, Walter tracked it down after the house sale collapsed and had it returned to Aspen as a joke. I ran my hand gently across the wood. For years I thought home was another person. A marriage. A family. A place where someone promised to stay. But age teaches you difficult truths. Sometimes the people you love most become the people you survive. And sometimes losing the wrong people is the first honest step toward finding peace. The cold mountain air filled my lungs as I looked out across Eleanor's property one final time. Then quietly, mostly to myself, I said, "For years I begged people to love me the way I deserved. Now I know real love never asks you to shrink first." The wind moved softly through the trees. Somewhere far below Aspen glowed quietly in the distance. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt completely at home. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever stayed too long in places that slowly broke your spirit, I hope you remember this. It is never too late to choose peace over performance. And sometimes the greatest revenge is simply becoming someone nobody can control anymore. Thank you for spending this time with me. And if this story touched your heart, I'd love for you to share it with someone who may need the reminder too.